I want to welcome you back to Enemy of My Truth, the space where we challenge the narratives that keep us small and step unapologetically into who we are really meant to be. This week's guest is someone whose path, practice, and presence I deeply, deeply admire. I had the honor and privilege of sitting down with Airi Mooers, a clinical therapist from New Hampshire, who didn't just hear the call of her intuition, she answered it. As a clinical therapist, psychic medium, Reiki Master Teacher, spiritual guide, and intuitive healer, Airi has built a dual practice that bridges science and spirit. She holds space in both the clinical and intuitive realms with depth and integrity, allowing each to inform and expand the other. In this episode, she shares her powerful journey of integration, what it's meant to fully embrace her abilities, and how that alignment has transformed her work and more so her life. I deeply enjoyed this conversation with Airi, and I'm so glad you're here to listen in. Let's dive into the episode. I am so honored and excited to have on the show today intuitive therapist Airi Mooers. Airi and I met several years ago through class, and we have worked together as not only colleagues and teacher and student, but as friends. And as I've watched her work evolve and the importance of the work she does as an intuitive therapist in this space, it's something I want to share with all of you. Airi is a clinical therapist, a psychic medium, Reiki Master Teacher, spiritual guide, and intuitive healer. Through using a combination of ancient energy medicine, neuroscience, and intuitive connection, she helps those heal the past, surrender to the present, and grow into who you want to become. Airi, I'm so glad that you're here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Anne. I'm so excited to be here.
I was really excited as we launched the podcast. You were one of the first people that came to mind as the importance in this space around healing and bridging the connection between our spiritual connection and that in the mental health space, and how we start to have more of a vocabulary around that, of perhaps blending the two and having permission to do that. And at the very least, having a conversation about how do we help ourselves heal without denying the part that is within us that wants to speak, and identifying it in some way that we may call it our intuition or our inner knowing, and coming together and being okay to have that conversation and what that can look like. And not only that, you stepping into this space, Airi, and inviting others to work with you to find that voice within themselves. So tell me a bit about what brought you to this place, being a clinical therapist, and then stepping into this spiritual space of your development with the audience.
Well, I think it's the only thing that I know how to do. I always have such a hard time when people ask me this question about how I came to practice this way, because I can't think about a time when I didn't. And I remember when I was, a young baby therapist, working with people. I didn't have a name for what I was feeling, but I would always know when something was important. And so I think over the years and receiving the validation from my clients made me trust that more. But I never really stopped to think about what it was. It was just always a part of me. It was just this is how I work.
So starting back, your profession as a clinical therapist, how far back do we go, Airi, with that? Can you bring us back to the beginning of when you began bring us back to the beginning of where you started as a clinical therapist?
Yeah. So I have been licensed since 2017. No, 2016. I have been working as a therapist since 2014. I was working in community mental health, doing the whole licensing thing where you have to work for however many hours before you get your license. And then I opened my private practice in 2019. And that was when I really gave myself permission, I think, to stretch beyond I mean, when you're working underneath somebody and you're trying to be the kind of therapist that your supervisors tell you that you should be, or that the textbooks tell you that you should be, um, I think you never really look into yourself. You're looking, like, when you're learning, you're looking at everybody else and being like, okay, this is what I'm aspiring to be. This is who I want to be like. And it wasn't until I opened my own practice where I didn't have anybody to look to, and so I had to look to myself. And that was it was a really powerful shift because I had to trust myself for probably the first time. There was nobody to go to beyond, it's like you have clinical supervision, but like there's nobody across the hall that you can run things by. And so you really have to trust yourself. And I think that was probably when I really fell in love with my job. Like, I love what I do. But before that, it was a job. And like, I've kind of lost the plot here, but I think,
Well, I had a question on that. So, as you say that you had no one to go to, what did that look like for you? Can you explain it as I'm seeing you go into this clinical practice, all the education and the training that you've had, and getting to that point? And I know the investment of anybody in the mental health space and the clinical work they have to do in getting there. When you were sitting in that clinical work and doing it, when did things switch for you where you felt like this is going beyond? There might be a very nice formula for doing clinical work. There's things that are a standard, okay? But where did things start to switch for you that you were feeling something more when you were connecting with your client, that it reached beyond your training? How did that start to show up in the session, I guess?
let me think about that because it's not something I've ever really thought about before. And I would say, in reality, it showed up well before I was in private practice. And I think I've always known that I am skilled at connecting with people. Um, and so that was a deep knowing. Like, if I sit down with somebody, I can feel them. I can feel, where they are and how to find them and how to connect with them. In the clinical work, like I mentioned before, like I can always, even in community mental health, like in the beginning, I could always feel when something was important. So if somebody mentioned something just briefly in the stream of conversation, I would get a ping of like, hang on, let's circle back to that. Or if I said something that resonated, would always get that feeling of like, this is true, this is important, follow that. Fast forward a few years to going out on my own, giving myself the permission to use language outside of traditional clinical language, I think is where it really started snowballing. Giving myself permission to model what I was doing in front of people, saying like, hang on a second, this is what I'm feeling right now. I'm feeling a lot of tension in my stomach. I'm feeling like I have, a wall in front of, my solar plexus area, like let's explore that a little bit. And then people are like, that's what I'm feeling. Like, okay, let's follow that. And then seeing the response in people, it's hard to find the language. Like,
Right. And I guess when you talk about clinical practice and language with that versus that intuitive knowing, what could you give an example of being in a situation where you are clinically supporting somebody and using your know-how and your education and your experience to clinically support them and guide them versus wanting to go off the beaten path with that, the straight and narrow, and intuitively connect with yourself? Is there something there that would be an example that you would be sitting with somebody and really feeling the need to jump out of that clinical seat and connect to them intuitively?
so again, this is a hard one for me because the two are so intertwined. Um, because I really can't think of a time when somebody comes in when I'm not working intuitively. I'm not. Can you go a little bit further with your question?
So, if you are in working with a patient or client and you are utilizing your clinical experience, that can feel, I would think at times, very universal. There's a universal piece of the experience as a clinical worker in that mental health field, whether it's the language, a protocol, certain steps to lay out an outline to help. That could be very universal in mental health space, versus knowing that that's not reaching the person. You're coming to the end of your session time, and it's almost as though they could spend another 3 hours with you because they're sinking. And it's like, okay, time's up. I'll see you, in another week. And so when you're in that space with somebody and you're using your training and realizing that you need to go deeper off the script, how has stepping into your natural intuitive abilities allowed you to step more fully into that, to know that your clinical practice is becoming less and less of how you want to show up and more honoring the intuitive healer that you are inside?
That is a great question. And I think it's a very timely question because as, as you were talking, I was chuckling to myself because like I very rarely show up in like a kind of protocol classic therapist-y way. And then when you got to that part where it's like, okay, you got 5-10 minutes left and the person I'm sitting with is really just struggling. And that happens a lot. And I think setting aside the ego of like, okay, we need to solve a problem and just like being like loving them. That's it. It's just like when we are trying to accomplish something, like if we are like, okay, what are we working on today? Yes, that is absolutely important. And I deeply value people's goals and what they want to accomplish in therapy. They're there for a reason. It's a financial investment and that is important. And sometimes like you just need to be human and love one another. And that's where like that heart piece comes in.
And what I'm hearing from you and what I've heard from this group of I call it the Intuitive Therapist Collective, is that sometimes in the clinical practice that I've heard from all of you, healing doesn't take place. It just continues on and on and on. And what about sitting with somebody and really seeing them and sitting in the space of feeling what they're feeling, to identify it, to acknowledge it? and finding a place where they do leave understanding more about themselves and moving forward with that. And so what I'm hearing from you is you really sit in that space with them and feel them. It's like the clinical hat comes off and the intuitive connection begins, and it's seamless. And so what I'm hearing from you is that really taking place, and it's not something you can necessarily articulate other than it just starts to naturally organic happen within the work that you're doing over the course of months and years.
I think that's exactly it. And I think the healing, it can happen in the blink of an eye, just in witnessing something. It can happen over months and years. And I think when the intuitive aspect, I feel like it comes from my heart. When I can open my heart, everything else comes along with it. But I think with that, like when we equal out the power dynamic, I think in a therapeutic relationship, there is an inherent power dynamic where somebody comes in and they're looking to you for healing. And when we can kind of like drop down and sit beside somebody rather than across from them, metaphorically, it's like, hey, like, I'm here with you. Like, I love you. Like, you
want them to see them. I wanted to ask you, when you started to really own your intuitive essence and the beautiful abilities that you have, Airi, did you start to develop your tools once in clinical practice? And if so, when did you start doing that? And what did you start to do to support yourself in this opening up?
So go back. Tools, intuitive tools or clinical tools or both?
So let's go back to, when did you start to develop and step into opening up and looking at your intuitive tools?
Mm-hmm.
So the clinical practice, you went through your schooling, you're in clinical practice, private practice. When did you start saying, hey, something's going on here? How do I start to understand, develop, and nurture this intuitive voice within me?
I think the first time I really recognized that I wanted to build on the intuitive aspect, going through EMDR training. EMDR is, are you familiar with it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You can share it with the audience just to.
Yep. So it stands eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And it's a protocol used to reprocess trauma. It's well known and very effective. And when I was going through the training, I found it to be profound, and I also felt like there was something missing. Like it felt like blasting through a locked door, rather than knocking and asking for permission. And I, without realizing it, started working like I could almost see the images in my head of what doors were available to go through, and who was behind those doors. And when I say who, I mean like what parts of the individual, what aspects of their personality or things that have happened. And so I could see that in my mind, and I just went with it. Like I was just like, okay, let's pretend. And I do a lot of pretending, and I find that when I tell myself to pretend, like, okay, let's pretend there is a child behind this door. Let's pretend, then it frees up my mind to not get so stuck on what needs to be real. But when I started doing that and just going with what I felt, it was like boom, 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 boom. All the pieces fell into place, and the like the sessions were smoother. The outcomes were more effective. They lasted longer without, kind of a backlash. And that was when I was like, okay, there is something to this. Like, I need to pursue this. And, I took a class how many have I taken with you?
I want to say a
Several.
handful. Yeah.
Yeah, several.
Yeah.
So I've taken several classes with you, and that was I initially did it for fun. I was like, you know what? Like, why not? This is something fun. My husband was away on vacation, and like then I was hooked. I had never really thought about that as something that you could learn. And so once I found that, I was just like, oh man, like this is fun. And this is the joy that I've been looking for. Like I love being a therapist, but there's sometimes not all that much joy. Like this feels like play.
Mm. Yeah. Well, and I love as you came into the class, like, I'm going to do it for fun, but really you are coming home to yourself. And we always say that the soul doesn't learn, it just remembers.
Exactly.
And you were remembering something that was within you. And then it's connecting those dots. And I know whenever I get therapists that come in for intuitive work or to train, I think that one day in class there was 3 therapists that like 2 of them knew each other, and then the other 2 were like, seriously. And you're looking at something here like, okay, wait a second.
Mhm.
And I'm honored because the importance of mental health is so incredibly powerful, and the respect I have for it and its place. So having therapists come, and then you're like, okay, what are we doing here? Like, this is very interesting. So as you came into the class, you started to develop, you're connecting the dots. And so when did you start to, Airi, make this jump as your clinical practice to this intuitive space where you have launched a website, working intuitively with your gifts? You are a Reiki Master Teacher, animal communicator, psychic medium, and an energy healer in this way. When did that come into play? So if we're going back to the timeline, to the time that you decided to jump off that cliff and say, here we go, world, here I am. This is what I have grown into, and I'm emerging from the cocoon in a way that's so badass, right? Especially in this clinical space. And the work you're doing, Airi, and especially with other therapists that you talk with and kind of share what you're doing, is allowing permission for other individuals in this medical space, this mental health space, to take a look at their own practice. And how do we expand that to really help and actually heal? Because the more we can heal ourselves, then we allow that to be a ripple effect around for people around us. So as we're healing, then they're bringing that home to their family in a way that is this sense of energy that's flowing out to those around us, and we're witnessing something and not staying in the loop. So what was that timeline from the beginning of your clinical practice to stepping out into your own? And talk a little bit about what you offer to the public and what that looks like today.
So I'm trying to think about the timeline. So I opened my practice in 2019 and, surrendered to the intuitive aspect. I don't remember what year I took a class with you, but in between that time, I got a horse. That was my COVID purchase. And I, I I'm like almost embarrassed to tell the story of how I got this horse. I've been around horses, loved horses. I've ridden my whole life. And I've never really given myself permission to have one because I always, I was the little kid that always asked for a horse for every single wish, Christmas, birthday, and it was just never happened. And during COVID, I was like, wait a minute, like why can't I? And I found a picture of this horse on Pet Finder. Nobody gets a horse on Pet Finder, and I was just like, that's my horse. Drove to Vermont with a trailer, and this mare, she's got a story. And of course, I needed the horse that was all sorts of traumatized and had all sorts of stuff. And she woke me up. She knocked me on my ass metaphorically, physically. She she's tried to kill me a couple times, literally, and it just she's my girl. And so that brought me into animal communication because I was like, what is going on? Like, I can feel her. I can feel her nervous system. Like, I could feel her. But I didn't know what she was saying besides F you. And so I met with an animal communicator, and she, like Hazel, my mare's name is Hazel, and she was just like, why aren't you listening to me? Like, why can't you hear me? And that was the overwhelming message. Um, it's like, well, I'm working with a communicator so that I can. She's like, no, you, and the just contempt on this, like on her face sometimes is amazing. But she's been my greatest teacher. And so she pushed me and pushed me and pushed me, and there was no refusing it. Like, she was not willing to accept no for an answer.
And how would you know that, Airi? Like when she would take no for an answer, or because what I'm hearing too is that she's forcing you to listen to yourself. Mm-hmm. And she's like, why are you not listening to me? But really, why are you not listening to yourself? So, what would she do, or what would show up in your life in that time period to let you know that you were not really listening or seeing yourself or her?
She's not subtle. I don't know if you could see the scar on my arm there.
Yes. Okay.
So she has a really hard time when somebody's insides do not match their outsides. And so if I'm like presenting as calm, but I'm not calm, absolute no for her. Or if I am not in alignment, like if I'm working with her and not really aligned or listening to myself, like she would tell me very loudly, first by biting, then, and now it's just an ear pin of like, check yourself, woman.
Okay.
But to get to that point of understanding what she was saying, like I had to learn how to trust her.
And I would say, who did you really have to trust?
That one was harder.
Right? Isn't that what it all comes back to? And I feel like animals and the power of animals and the beauty and the healing of these beautiful teachers that come in, mm-hmm. that she was, I would say, not to put words in your mouth, but she was almost like I could see her head nudging you, like, would you listen to yourself? Would you trust yourself? Mm-hmm. And in hearing from you that the introduction to animal communication was really about innately listening to yourself. And I'm also guessing too, Airi, that it took a teacher of that strength and that stubbornness to break through yours.
Yes. Yeah. We are equally stubborn.
Yes. So you stepped in, Hazel came into your life, which is, an incredible teacher, obviously. And I can see those lifetimes that you've had together with each other. And that's mm-hmm. a whole nother session right there. So as she came into your life, when was that call getting louder for you to really identify your work as an intuitive and start to hold space and offer that? Because I feel like the work that we do, and I can only speak for myself, that it's bigger than me, meaning that there are days where I can make it about myself. Like, did I do that okay? Did I suck? Like, what, people, want to work with me. And, if we don't have that constant imposter syndrome that checks us, I think that voice will always be there, but it's the voice so much larger than us that says, mm-hmm. keep going. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, there's days more than not that it won't be. But it nudges you. It's like she's nudging you. It's like this energy nudges us to just keep going, even when at times it feels very uncomfortable. So when did you make that switch to create the website? And what does that look like today if somebody wants to come see you and work with you intuitively in the things that you offer?
Mm-hmm. So I launched the website, I think 2022. It might have been 23. But there were several years in between, and several years of deep healing for myself. And that, I think growing, learning about myself, there were several, events that occurred during that time. like built on one another. And so it wasn't a fast journey. I mean, I never really considered, like, I'm pretty content as a therapist. And so I never really considered that I wanted more. But the more that I showed up in that way, the more it, it almost just feels like it's important to claim it. Rather than, it's not necessarily that there's an enormous distinction. There is a distinction between the clinical work and the intuitive work. But more than that, it's just that I needed to claim it out loud publicly.
And once you did that, and I'm sure, how much hesitation did you have to like press launch or to say, here we go, to it's being authentically ourselves. And I find that our higher self doesn't allow us to live any other way. We can try, we can duck it, we can deny it, we can hide it, we can call it something else. But our higher selves, it's just like Hazel, like nudging you, like, yeah, right. That's, it's like your higher self bites you. It trips you up and it says, wait a second, why is this happening to me? And we're creating that. So as you made that leap, and I think one of the things to talk about right here too is those that see you clinically and the boundaries that you have in the policies. Can you share a little bit about that, working with one hat versus the other and how you work with people that way?
Yeah. So I take ethics really seriously. I'm a clinical social worker, and the rule, like, no dual relationships. And so,
and what does that mean?
I cannot have a relationship with somebody in more than one way. And so what that means is if somebody is a client, I cannot be, I can't see them intuitively. Like I do intuitive therapy, but it's psychotherapy. So I can't have somebody come in for a mediumship reading. I can't have somebody, I can't be friends with somebody. I can't, get together with somebody outside of therapy. And so the two are pretty distinct. If somebody comes to me strictly for intuitive work, I can't see them as a client, as a therapy client.
Got it. Okay.
And so it doesn't go both directions.
Okay. If somebody wanted to come see you, they could see you obviously either clinically, and that's one area. But if they wanted to come see you intuitively, and this is somebody that cannot see you prior to your clinical practice, to be someone separate from that work, why would someone want to come see you for your intuitive work?
As opposed to somebody else, you mean?
Right. As opposed to saying, is there a distinction between someone needing you clinically versus intuitively?
Gotcha. So I think my energy is much larger when I'm working with somebody intuitively. And so, like, I'm not going to, like, if somebody comes in for traditional psychotherapy, it's their session. I'm not going to lead them, say, okay, this is coming in, this is coming in, this is coming, that's not the purpose of the session. And so I think if somebody's looking for guidance, if somebody's looking to explore or to find out the places to explore, I would say intuitive work is where it's at. If somebody already understands themselves and knows where they need to go to find the healing, I would say therapy. It's people who come in for intuitive sessions. It's usually a one and done, maybe every couple months. They're like, I feel stuck. I need a tune up. Something's going on. Like something's not hearing a message. Whereas somebody who comes for therapy, it's like, I just don't feel good. I need help with something.
Right. Needs your clinical experience. And so just to be very clear, those that see you clinically cannot see you through your intuitive work. And those that are intuitive, could they go into your clinical practice? They just couldn't go back to the intuitive?
Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make that clear. You do work out of the state of New Hampshire for your clinical work, but you work remotely for anybody for your intuitive work. Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm licensed as, so I can see people clinically in New Hampshire, Maine, and Florida, weirdly enough. And then for intuitive work anywhere.
Okay. And are people seeing you in person or Zoom?
Both.
Okay. So I guess what I would love is we could I want to keep talking to you and going down this road, but it gives us a bit of a snapshot and a conversation, Airi, blending these two worlds together and having things that are more acceptable and having a dialogue around the mental health space, but that's really blended with the sense of our spiritual self and almost giving permission, which is just a great word, to explore it, to have a conversation. And I find that there's so much more interest out there than we knew about that's coming to the surface. And you holding space for yourself on both sides of these coins, I honor it and I respect it so much because it's so incredibly needed. And you are blazing your own trail with this, but I find the work you're doing is inspiring others to look at their own practice, not only clinically, but the practice of themselves, and saying maybe there is more, and it could be scary, but look at so much of what you're doing to help others in this space to expand. You said you're expansive in that space. And isn't that what we're about? To expand and to share that light and that energy. And I'm just honored to know you and to see the work that you're doing. So, Airi, how can people find you? Let our audience know how they can get a hold of you and where they can find you.
I think the best place to, contact me is probably my website. Are you going to link it in the show notes, or should I?
Yeah, you can share it, but yeah, I'll link it as well.
Yeah, it's just airimoersintuitive.com. Okay. And then for therapy, it's just airimoers.com.
Okay, fantastic. I hope to have you back on the podcast again, and we might be bringing some other therapists in that share this conversation. But thank you for being here. I know you're kind of battling a little bit of a cold, but you did great. And it's just so great to see you. And I'm excited to see the things that are going to unfold in this space together and for you personally, professionally. So thank you for being here.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. Take care.
You too. Thanks.